Hello, good morning to the American colleagues, good afternoon to the European colleagues, and good evening or good night to the Australian colleagues. So I'm really glad to introduce the 7th and last session. And just after the session, there will be the general discussion. So for this last session about carceral continuum, we will have 3 presentations, and I will leave the floor to Anouk Mertens, who will present a paper she prepared with Freya Vander, Laenen, which is called Pains of Imprisonment Beyond Prison Walls, Lived Experience of Females Labeled Not Criminally Responsible. So the floor is yours, Anouk.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Olivier. I will start my presentation. I hope you can all see it. Is it working? Can you give me feedback?
Yes, okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, all. I'm Anouk Mertens, and I'm currently working at the National Institute of Criminalistics and Criminology, but presenting in here my PhD research conducted at Ghent University between 2014 and 2018 under supervision of Freya Vander Laenen. In this talk, I would like to give you some more information about the study on the experiences of females labeled not criminally responsible confined in different institutions. So to introduce you to my project, I would like to give you some background information. In the study, we've used the classical theoretical framework of the importation and deprivation models. And in this talk, I will give you an insight into the study results, which, although it was conducted within a more classical criminological framework, could fit to the carceral geography knowledge. For those not familiar with this framework, basically these models have been developed to explain the experiences and adjustments in prison. And according to the first model, the importation model, demographic, social and psychological characteristics of prisoners can help to explain their adaptations in prison. And these pre-prison features, for example, age, criminal history, but also psychiatric problems, were already present before the confinement and are imported into the prison setting. And the second model, the deprivation model, assumes that the experiences of prisoners can be influenced by features of the institution itself, like contact with staff and other prisoners, the amount of visits, and so on. So prisoners are basically deprived and experiencing a loss. We also know this as the pains of imprisonment, which was revisited in 2011 by Crew, who identified 3 more pains of imprisonment. In Belgium, a subgroup of people residing in prisons are people labeled not criminally responsible, also known as interned people or internees. So internees are people who've committed a crime but are not held criminally responsible for their act due to a mental illness. And since the sanction is indefinite, they don't know when the internment measure will be terminated. So the purpose of this measure is providing care and protecting safety of the society and the prison and the person itself. And these interned people are in need of a psychiatric treatment, but because there are not enough places in psychiatric hospitals, and as we can see in this figure here, many end up in prison. And when we look at our Belgian situation, at the start of the study, so in 2014-2015, we see that from the 11,000 prisoners, 900 of them were persons labeled as not criminally responsible, and there were 485 female prisoners residing in prisons. And as we can see in here, the subgroup of females labeled not criminally responsible who are imprisoned was quite small at that moment, and is still smaller right now. And after receiving several European convictions, Belgium invested in the expansion of a forensic psychiatric network, which led to the decline of the amount of interned people in Belgian prisons. And this decline had already started during our project, which made it extremely interesting to try to identify experiences within different institutions. So the aim of our study was to explore the experiences of these women under an internment measure in different spaces of confinement. So in this presentation, I'll focus on the results of the interviews I've conducted during the study. And as the population of female internees was quite small, so female internees residing in prisons, our aim was to try to involve the entire population. And that's why I've conducted interviews in the 4 prisons housing female internees. And in Belgium, there are no prisons for women only, but the majority of these women were residing in one prison with a specific ward for female internees. And you can see the prison here at the right. 1 to 2 years later, I've conducted all women who wanted me to do so again and conducted interviews in the settings they were residing at that moment. So some were still in prison. And others were residing in forensic mental health care institution, specifically built for people under an internment measure. Lots of women were residing in one high secure institution, specifically built for females who were not criminally responsible. And it's aimed to be secured on the outside and to provide care on the inside. And as you can see here, there are also high fences, so it really looks like a prison on the outside. And there are also a lot of security measures when entering this setting. Some women were residing in forensic medium security institutions, so also especially for people labeled not criminally responsible. Others were residing in general psychiatric hospitals, and some were staying at home. And in the next slide, you can see an overview of the response of these interviews. The level of refusals of all imprisoned females under an internment measure was quite low, and interviews were conducted with 51 participants in the 4 prisons housing female internees. All but 2 of the participants agreed to be contacted again for a follow-up interview 1 to 2 years after the first interview. And during the follow-up phase, there was a small dropout due to refusals, so 2, and some who were not, who I was not able to locate. And unfortunately, there was also a dropout caused to some diseases. So follow-up interviews were carried out with 42 participants in different facilities. So 15 in prison, still remaining or again remaining in prison, 17 in a forensic mental health care setting, and 7 in a general mental health care setting, and 3 women were staying at home. So I will now focus on the experienced pains of these women in the different spaces they were residing during the follow-up phase. So most imprisoned participants were particularly affected by the deprivation of liberty, and that's also the most obvious deprivation when residing in a prison setting. The loss of liberty was mentioned in all narratives during the first and follow-up interviews, but it was not limited to prison facilities. So the difficulty of losing one's liberty was also mentioned in closed and secured forensic care settings, as you can also see in here in this quote. So these women experienced that they were not able to leave the facility, and secondly, within the facility itself, they could not move freely. Participants in general care mentioned the loss of liberty less frequently. They were mainly grateful for the freedom they had retrieved after their prison stay, so the loss of liberty in that setting was less experienced. The loss of liberty not only restricted the physical freedom, but it also implied a restriction on informal social contacts with significant people in the outside world. Almost all participants in every type of setting mentioned that these contacts were very important to them. And once again, this pain was not limited to participants in prison facilities. Women in forensic care also experienced extreme restrictions on contacts with people outside, for example, due to distance difficulties to be visited. But there were also liberty moments to look forward to. In prison, some women had penitentiary leaves, moments of movement when they were able to leave the setting for a day or more to visit family, search a job, and so on. When transferred to the forensic care, these liberty moments unfortunately were abolished, and they were sometimes even more restricted in the liberty than when residing in prison. In general, contact with people in the outside world was thus an important topic among all participants. Here I want to point out one specific thing related to contact and experienced intimacy with a partner. Private visits and intimacy were mentioned spontaneously in some narratives. However, it can be noteworthy that some women residing in forensic care mentioned that they were more restricted in contacts with a partner than they had been during their time in prison, as the ability of private visits in prison were not allowed anymore in forensic care. So we can see also more restrictions in here. The next deprivation I want to discuss with you is the deprivation of security. Most women reported feeling rather safe in prison, sometimes even more safe than when they lived in the outside world. Others mentioned feeling unsafe at time, mostly due to fellow prisoners and patients' aggression in prison and in forensic care, as you can also see in this quote here. Living alongside their peers in all institutions was not always perceived positively. Most participants experienced some positive interactions with fellow prisoners and patients, so in all settings, as they were able to talk to and help each other. Yet they also experienced tensions, and maybe more specifically in forensic care, living within the group was a part of the therapy program and was also experienced as something very difficult. So in prisons and forensic care, almost all women experienced a significant loss of autonomy. They did not have any freedom of choice and were obliged to ask permission for everything. So in both types of facilities, so in the prison and in forensic care setting, several participants felt heavily dependent on professionals. Participants in general care did not share this experience, or not in that great extent. On the contrary, they experienced less restrictions of their autonomy and retrieved more responsibilities. Considering the final deprivation identified by Sykes, some participants experienced material deprivations in their cells or in their rooms. And all women emphasized the importance of interesting daily activities. So in prison, participants appreciated the organized daily activities. And in healthcare settings, most participants also appreciated the therapy sessions. These were all perceived to be supportive and gave them distraction. In prison, the daily activities were organized frequently, but it was quite a difference when entering forensic care, where days were structured with therapy session after therapy session. And also in there, several participants found it difficult to be restricted in the choice of therapy session, and especially because of the focus on the committed offenses and the obligation to talk about the offenses over and over again. So in all types of setting, participants reflected on the interactions with healthcare professionals, which were also very important to them. They strongly valued professionals who tried to make time to listen to them, which was sometimes lacking, as you can read in the last quote in here. So next to the classic deprivations, our participants also experienced the pains described by Crew. The indefinite duration of the internment measure caused a lot of insecurities, and participants in the study frequently spoke about the internment measure they were subjected to. They found its unspecified length and the uncertainty about when it would end and when they would leave the prison or the treatment trajectory very, very stressful. They felt very insecure about conditional release and were worried about violating conditions. They especially feared being reincarcerated, particularly as a lot of the participants already had experienced reincarcerations and felt to start over again in their trajectories. Also, the pain of psychological assessments was experienced by the women. In prison, participants have emphasized the importance of the psychological service, a service exercising an important level of control on their internment trajectory as they experienced. They frequently mentioned long waiting times for the service, which induced a feeling of not moving forwards. The psychological service provides an advice to the Chamber for the Protection of Society, the CPS, and the CPS makes decisions about people under an internment measure, about their re-entry into society or in institutions and their conditional release conditions. Participants criticized the powerlessness they felt about their treatment trajectories. They did not feel involved in decisions taken by the CPS. Also, when they were residing in general care or at home, there was a lack of voice in these decisions. And a final pain identified by crew is the increase in responsibility in modern prisons, with prisoners held increasingly responsible for their own acts. The participants in the study also mentioned this. Some experienced that they were responsible for doing it better when they were released, for instance, by staying out of trouble or not using substances. And as noted before, most participants desired more voice about their trajectory, their treatment and daily activities and so on. So all those experienced pains made us think about the source of these pains. We can surely tell that the space where they were residing or the people working there caused particular pains. But in this population, being under an internment measure was related to all described pains. And in fact, this particular measurement even transcended the space of residence. The insecure
5 minutes left.
Thank you. The insecure future causes stress to every woman I've talked to. Even when residing in general care or at home, there was still some level of judicial control, the CPS. They still had to follow rules and conditions, although some deprivations were experienced less often. The insecurities about their trajectories caused a lot of pain, especially when knowing some were already in the system for 10 or 20 years and were not making any progression as experienced. And this is the system of the internment measure. I mean, it's not the trajectories they already had been through, the care trajectories when they were not under an internment measure. So some women are already their whole lives in a care system, and they feel that they are not making any progression in this. And to end my talk about the experienced pains and deprivations, I want to point out that some also had positive experiences related to the internment measure or the place of residence. For example, saying that this measure was needed to get rid of drug addictions or to get their lives back on track. So it was not pain at all times. There were sometimes also positive experiences in this. And we can conclude that the classical deprivation framework developed lots of years ago, and also although we live in different times and in more modern prisons, can be applied to females not criminally responsible residing in different types of setting. And importantly, most participants in facilities other than prison, and more specifically in forensic secure care, were also experiencing these pains. And we can see that although we expect lots of progression in experiences when care is provided as intended by the internment measure, there is no continuum in their carceral experience. There are less experienced pains once residing in general care or at home, but there are not at all less experienced deprivations and sometimes even more experienced pains in forensic care compared to prison. And for sure, the internment measure is intertwined in all these experienced pains, which made us think that next to the places of residence as a source of the carceral experiences, there might be something like a carceral status with a level of judicial control that hangs over these women in this case, regardless of their place of residence, but with inherent pains like insecurities and anxieties. And this has also been found in other research, like Anouk's study on young females in Scotland. So I mean, all the pains I've described, but I also heard a lot of interesting things this morning in other papers. So maybe this is something that can be discussed. I'm very curious to find out about more research about this. something like a carceral status, not necessarily restricted to a prison or a care setting, but maybe more broadly. One thing is certain. Thank you. One thing is certain in all those narratives, that trajectory is a process of trial and error, that they also recognize. Most of them know this and want to do it better. They just want a better future for them and their families. I want to thank you for your attention. You're still muted, Olivier. Sorry.
Excuse me. Thank you very much, Anouk and Freya, for this paper, which raises many questions. And I, since I have the chance of being the chair, I will be the first to ask questions. The others can use the question and answer system, of course. Just to have a question about the last word, very interesting, about carceral status. Could you elaborate a little bit more about this status, you know, how to define it? But thank you very much again. How would you define this carceral status?
Okay, thank you, Olivier. Well, it is something new for me, I think, and I think Freya can agree with this also. We've conducted this research within the theoretical framework deprivation and importation, and I think it was probably almost at the end of the PhD study that we thought of carceral geography and how this could intervene in our research. So I think the status, as I mentioned here, is more something like the level of judicial control that still remains, and it's not directly, or maybe a little bit related to the place they are staying, but it's more specifically related to the internment measure itself. It's the internment measure that causes insecurities and anxieties about the future, and it's the judicial control that still hangs over there, and it's not specifically the place where they stay. And that made me think about maybe it's next to the carceral experience in the places, it can be maybe also the carceral status that causes pains, not only for interned people, but maybe also for people in a psychiatric care institution, people in asylum centers, and so on. So maybe the status in itself can provide some carceral experiences also. I hope I answered the question that way.
Yeah, thank you very much. So there are two questions. I will put them only two because they are related. One asks, could you elaborate, please, about the link between the positive experiences of some women? So did they accept the carceralized environment because they saw a positive side of their detention? And at the same time, there is another question about the stigmatization. So to say a little bit more about how this population, how this population perceived by the general carceral population. So to say, how can you be both stigmatized and at the same time accept the carceralized environment or seeing positive sides? Thank you, and beforehand.
Okay, well, it's not in all cases that they experience positive things, but I found it important to note this because I don't want to be the one that says it's all negative. There are also positive things, although you have to search for them sometimes. Yeah, there is of course a stigma inside the prisons, but maybe I will first answer Christophe's question about the acceptation about the carceral environment. I don't think there is one woman I've spoke to that accepted the carceral environment, especially not in a prison setting, because a prison setting is not meant to house people under an internment measure. And they also know this, and they also really fighting against that. And during the project, there were a lot of females who were leaving the prisons because there was an extension of our forensic network. So that's a positive thing. But although we have to be aware that there are also pains inside other settings. So I don't think they really accept the carceral environment in either setting they were residing, but still they see that the internment measure also caused some positive things, because some say they really needed it to get rid of addictions, to get their lives back on track. But maybe it's more experienced once they are in a general mental health care institution or at home, because there were not a lot of positive experiences in a prison or forensic care institution linked to the institution itself, but linked to the internment measure. Some really recognized that this was needed to get their lives back on track. And for the second question about the stigmatization, how are they perceived by the general carceral population? I can only speak about the experiences of the women I've spoke to. This I cannot speak for the other, the general carceral population. But the women I've spoke to really felt that they were seen like like a mad person, a bad person. So they most of all they recognize the offenses they committed, but sometimes the illness that is there, that's something they don't always recognize. So sometimes they feel like being watched as a mad person, but they don't feel like being a mad person, and that's sometimes causing a lot of stigmatizations in there. I hope this answers the question.
Okay, thank you. Anouk, there is another question raised by Amber Kara-Nicolas, who thank you again for this presentation. And she would love to know a bit more about the circumstances of the women your research was based on. Were there any common factors or any commonalities in their circumstances in terms of class, deprivation, gender discrimination, or was it like a very diverse population?
Yeah, it was quite a mixed population. In this presentation, I wanted to focus on the deprivation experiences, but I've also looked into the imported experiences within interviews, but also within file studies we have conducted. And we can see that there are a lot of commonalities. For example, a lot of women already had been through a care trajectory for quite a long time, even some when they were still a kid. So some are really having a lot of long care trajectory before the internment measure. Related to class, I don't really know exactly what you mean, but we've searched into the education level, and that's also was quite common. So most of them went to primary school and not to a higher school or high school. So that was also something that was really common. And maybe I want to point out also one thing regarding to the imported features of these women, and that was the abuses they have went to. So there were a lot of sexual, physical, but also emotional abuses during childhood, during adulthood. So that was also something that was very common with a lot of women I've spoke to, not all the women, but I think to approximately half of them or more had experienced abuses. So that was also something that was very common.
Okay, thank you. We just have 1 minute for a last question. Someone, thank you again for the presentation, says how fascinating it is and at the same time very sensitive. And so could you speak very briefly about the ethics committee approval processes I guess you had to go through?
Yes, so of course we went to an ethics committee, and I see the sun is shining in my screen, but I hope you can still see me. Okay, thank you. Yes, we had to have ethical approvals. I think in our university we had maybe the chance that there was another great project that started a year, or I think a year before I started. So there was another project also with interned people who went to a lot of ethical committees, but I was not involved in that project. My project was started later, but I think the approval of that big research project maybe had some positive influences on my project. There were not a lot of difficulties, as I can remember, by approving the project. I don't know if Freya still reminds some difficulties we went through, but I cannot remember any difficulties. But of course, it stays a sensitive population, so it's yeah, you really need to to try to bond with them, and that was something I did in the first phase. So I've participated in daily activities to make sure that I connected with them before I've conducted the interviews. So in an informal way, I've tried to bond with them first before the interviews. But if Freya wants to add something, you're free, and if not, I think we have to stop.
Yeah, thank you very much, but we will continue, I guess, this discussion in the chat room after the session, and also because there are other questions raised in the question and answer, so we will have some time in the chat room. Thank you very much. Now we will move to the next presentation presented by Deirdre Conlon and Andrew Burridge. So I will leave the floor to Deirdre. Her talk is called Immigration Reporting in the UK, Spaces and Politics of Indistinction in the Carceral Continuum. So Deirdre, will put you online.
Olivier, I'm getting a message that the screen is not being shared or something like that. Is it being shared? Can you just confirm?
So for the moment, it is not shared.
Not shared.
So it is not shared for the moment. We encounter some technical problems today, but we will manage to share it very soon. So your paper about immigration reporting in the UK will appear very soon.
Okay, yeah, I'm just going to try again to share my my screen.
Okay.
Just 1 moment.
Thank you very much.
Okay. No.
So just to let the attendees know.
Sorry, I don't see the shared screen, so it's not possible now to share it.
Okay.
Okay, we will try to fix that briefly, and maybe during that time, if we have time with a last question to Anouk.
Sure.
About the women, were there many of these women chronic re-offenders? a short question, and if you can unmute your microphone, Anouk.
Yes, I'm not sure if okay, I can see the question. Wait a minute. Okay. Yes, chronic reoffenders. No, I think not at all. Although maybe some of them really had a long history of committing offenses, but there were also some women who just committed one offense and after that getting into the internment procedure. Do you think this may have contributed to the positive associations? That can be. That is not something that I've searched into depth, but it might be indeed that this also caused some positive experiences because they are getting their lives back on track, which means, of course, also not committing offenses.
Okay, thank you very